Hi, Susanna. Hi, Wendy.
Hello.
Hi, I'm just in a Teams at the moment.
Hi, Dodie.
Wow. Hello, everyone. I can see Ryan. Agnes is on from the department. And so, Ryan, it will be yourself, Tom, and Jane on today.
It'll be Tom and myself. Jane is an apology today,
great.
unfortunately, but you're in our very capable hands.
Yes, I have had the presentation from Tom before. He's great. So I was just wondering if maybe that I ask once Tom's here that you do the presentation and then anyone who's got any questions, maybe put them in the questions because there's quite a large number of people attending the presentations. It might be easier to do it at the end. Would that work for you, Ryan, do you think?
So, yeah, we will have around 5 or 10 minutes of presentation, depending on how we get on with time, but that leaves plenty of time for a bit of discussion and Q&A at the end. So,
great.
Yeah, heaps and heaps of time for all the questions that we may have.
Thank you.
And Ryan, just for your information, we are recording the session and we do have Fireflies, which is an AI tool that we use to also record Q&A, just making sure you're comfortable with that.
No worries. Thanks, Abby.
No worries.
Always good to get the heads up.
I did put that in the email when I was talking to Tom, but you might not have been in that first initial conversation, Ryan.
Oh, it's all right. I'm not too worried about recording.
We just thought it would make it easier if anyone who can't attend today, we can send the recording out, and then it saves you having to do the recording.
Afternoon,
presentation. Dottie. Hello.
Hey, Dottie. How are you? Tom here.
Good. Oh, hi, Tom. So Tom and Ryan are both here now. So I think we have got quite a number of people on, and I just wanted to thank both Tom and Ryan for coming today and presenting on the Aged Care Substitute Decision Making Act for Victoria, because there's been quite a number of questions on the changes, and obviously everyone's aware that from the 1st of July, the changes of the consent under this Act came into play. So we thought it would be easier if Tom and Ryan could present to everyone, and then if there's any questions, Ryan just said that there'd be enough time for a bit of Q&A at the end of the presentation. And I might just, can you share, Tom, or do I need to give you?
I've got share access. I can drive this on, Tom, if that's easier, because I've got it all up and ready to go anyway.
Beautiful. I think we might just move ahead if that's okay. There's lots of people.
Susanna's just asked a question, what page of the Act are we referring to?
So we're referring to this Act here, the Aged Care Restrictive Practices Substitute Decision Maker Act, which is the Victorian-based legislation. So this Act in its entirety. Perhaps, Tom, if you could dig up the direct link to this one so people can pull
that would be great.
up. Yeah.
Thank you. Then we can follow along.
Yeah, excellent. All right. Well, before we kick off formally, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the many and various lands of which we're all gathering from today. Tom and I are joining you all from Melbourne on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. So I would like to pay my respects to their elders past and present, but I'd also like to extend that respect to all First Nation peoples joining us today and to the custodians of the lands each of you joining the session are dialing in from. So thanks everyone for coming along to today's session. Hopefully this adds a bit of context and a bit of demystifying with this new piece of legislation. So start off with a quick bit of a background as to what this is, because I appreciate there's lots of acts and regulations and things flying around and can be a little bit confusing given the stuff that we're doing at state level and of course the whole wealth of things happening at the Commonwealth level with the new Aged Care Act and the Aged Care rules and everything else that's going on there. So just as a bit of background, so this particular piece of reform, like everything else happening in aged care, it draws its roots from in 2021 with the Aged Care Royal Commission. So in that 2021 Royal Commission into aged care, the Commonwealth Government made some amendments following on from one of those recommendations. I believe it was recommendation 17, but don't quote me on that one, around tightening the use of restrictive practices. So that's where the Commonwealth amended their share legislation to include a whole range of new requirements for the use of restrictive practices, which I imagine everyone on this call is quite familiar with. For example, the use of them as a last resort, only after trialing other alternatives. And of course, most salient for this session today, a new requirement that all restrictive practices must have informed consent provided by the aged care recipient. And if they do not have capacity, which is generally the case when we're discussing restrictive practices, from a particular person called a restrictive practices substitute decision maker. So someone who can provide a consent on their behalf. Of course, this decision maker is required when the aged care recipient does not have capacity. So that is the particular cohort that we need to keep in mind that this new act applies to. The broader Tory oversight for restrictive practices always has and continues to sit with the Commonwealth. So all requirements for when and how you use restrictive practices, any reporting requirements, compliance obligations, all of those things, they still continue to be set by the Commonwealth and driven by the Aged Care Act and its subordinate legislation, things like the aged care rules or the quality of care principles. However, one new thing that the Commonwealth did when they were amending this act is when they defined who is a restricted practices substitute decision maker, they essentially left that blank and said defer to state and territory legislation, which means you have to look at what's in place for Victoria. This is where we get into the issue that we had previously prior to this new act coming into effect. So in the middle of the slide, we unpack what that meant for Victoria. Our legislation at the time did not allow the typical types of substitute decision makers to make this type of decision around restricted practices specifically. So although we have guardians, we have the public advocate, we have people with enduring powers of attorney, none of those legislative arrangements allow those decision makers to make decisions around restricted practices. They can make decisions around where people live, how their finances are managed, things like medical treatment, all of those sorts of things, but not restricted practices. Similarly, because restricted practices are not a type of medical treatment in and of themselves, our medical treatment decision-making frameworks also do not apply. So Victoria had a bit of an awkward gap where we had nothing at state base. We had no clear arrangements at state level that will satisfy this definition that the Commonwealth was asking aged care providers to then defer to. So what that meant is we essentially needed to pass legislation. The Commonwealth did have in place a temporary hierarchy as a bit of a stopgap measure. So I assume everyone on the call is quite familiar with this. It was essentially another hierarchy of decision maker, starting with nominees, working way through to immediate next of kin, through to sort of extended family and friends, and then down to medical treatment decision makers as a last resort. So since 1 July 2025, Victoria has established and passed new legislation that has now come into effect, which puts in place a new mandatory framework for how substitute decision makers are identified or appointed. So this framework takes precedence over the Commonwealth hierarchy. So for all intents and purposes, this is the arrangement that will be in use going forward. I do want to just re-emphasize the point of what this Victorian legislation does. The Victorian legislation is focused entirely on defining who is a restricted practices substitute decision maker. This legislation does not provide any additional requirements or guidance for the use of restricted practices. It doesn't put any onus on providers who do things any differently to what the Aged Care Act requires around how restraints are even used, how you assess people for the behavioural support needs, anything to do with the behavioural support plans, all of that continues to exist within Commonwealth requirements. So as far as Victorian government's concerned and this legislation is concerned, this only defines who is that restricted practices substitute decision maker, which sounds simple, but I appreciate there is still quite a bit of complexity to unpack there. So this act does plug that legislative gap. As I mentioned, it is in place from 1 July, so it is in effect right at this moment. So we'll go through the hierarchy itself in a bit of a quick summary to try and give people a sense of how it works and operates. Before I dive into the contents of the slide, I will preface by saying, for anyone who's familiar with the medical treatment decision-making legislation in Victoria, for example, who can consent to medical treatment decisions, our Act for Restricted Practices is quite similar in many ways and shares the same sort of principles, notwithstanding that it is a standalone framework, but there is quite a lot of commonality and similarity there. So when trying to find the appropriate restricted practices substitute decision maker, this is assuming, of course, that all the Commonwealth requirements have been satisfied. It's been determined that the aged care resident A needs restricted practices and B does not have capacity to consent for themselves. That is when you can then engage this framework. At the very top, we have Tier 1, which is called a restricted practices substitute decision maker nominee, or just nominee for short. Essentially, this is someone that's been appointed by the resident in advance. It's someone who's been chosen by the person and has been formally appointed in writing. An important principle to understand here is that Tier 1 is done in advance. It's done before the aged care resident has lost capacity. It's based on who they wish to act as a substitute decision maker. So in many respects, this Tier 1 nominee is intended to operate very similarly to other decisions around who can make decisions, for example, in advanced care planning for medical treatment, where it's sort of like bringing in those principles for powers of attorney, where someone sets up in advance before they lose capacity who they want to be trusted with these types of decisions. It will be apparent who is a nominee because there will be that formal documentation that appoints them. So to support people in making these nominations and supporting aged care providers in understanding who is the nominee, we are prescribing template forms for people to use to create those nominations. And so there will be a very clear document that that nominee can provide to you to say, I am this person, I should be the one making these decisions. So it will be a lot clearer. Where it can get a little bit more complicated is what happens when there is no nominee or the nominee is not available and you need to find someone else. That's when you move down the hierarchy to Tier 2, what we have dubbed the temporary decision maker. This is similar to what we do have for medical treatment decision making, where it's the immediate next of kin. So it's the first person in the order of these people, the spouse or partner, or the primary carer. And by carer, we are referring to a non-commercial relationship, so someone who's not paid to be the carer, the eldest adult child, or the eldest parent, if for some reason that person happens to be around and is capable of making decisions, and failing that, the eldest sibling. Where we mention, for example, the oldest adult child, parent, or sibling, if there are multiple children or parents or siblings at play, you can move to the next eldest child if the eldest child is not available or not willing to act as a decision maker. So there's sort of mini sub-hierarchies there, if you can picture that. Important thing to know with the temporary decision maker is, much like with medical treatment decision making, there is not clear documentation that says this is the person. So someone can't say, look, I have the certificate that says I am the spouse. Or actually, you can for that one, so that was a bad example. But for example, when you're trying to find the eldest adult child, there's no documentation that says I am the temporary decision maker because there is no spouse, because there is no carer, because I am that person. So much like with medical treatment decision making, there is an element of the aged care provider needing just to suss out the situation for themselves and understand, is this the right person? That's not to mean, for example, that aged care providers and staff need to undertake robust background checks and do investigations into the private life of people to try and work out and really exclude people higher up in the hierarchy. Really is doing some basic due diligence and working in good faith to really find that right person. But there is no need to, for example, hire a private investigator and try and really delve into that situation. We completely understand that you can only work with what you know and what you can know as well. So hopefully this second tier doesn't stress people out too much. But keep in mind, and if it helps, that this is very similar to what you need to do with medical treatment decision making. We need to find the appropriate family member. Just work through it in exactly the same way. It follows the exact same principles. As I said, because there is no formal documentation that says I am this tier 2 person, this is something that aged care providers and you all might need to work out how you actually document this decision maker. So Victorian legislation does not put in any specific requirements of how you document who a decision maker is, as we appreciate that there's a whole range of requirements already around documentation and information gathering that you may be subjected to do under the Aged Care Act. So we've left this deliberately flexible for Ludden Valley to work out for itself how best to document who the appropriate decision maker is in this situation. Where there is no temporary decision maker, as in there is no immediate family in that person's life that is available or willing to act as a decision maker, you may need to move to Tier 3, which is an appointee or a VCAT appointee. So this is anyone that could be appointed by VCAT to act as a substitute decision maker for restrictive practices. We haven't put in any clear requirements for who that person must be. We have put in the legislation some examples for who that could be, but that's not an exhaustive list. It's just meant to be some general ideas of who that could be. The main requirement for this person is that the appointee has to have a close and continuing personal relationship with the older person or the aged care recipient, as in that's someone that would be trusted to make these decisions and they know who that person is. So it can't be a general stranger. The other requirement is that potential appointee would need to make that application to VCAT to become appointed as a restricted practices substitute decision maker. So an example of this happening would be someone's cousin is a potential appointee. There are no other immediate family available to be appointed. That cousin makes the application to VCAT. They get the court order from VCAT saying you are now the decision maker. They are now the decision maker. So unlike Tier 2, where there is no clear paper trail that affirms when someone is an appointee, this one is a bit clearer. They will have that VCAT order, and that's a nice official document that can be easily squared away. It's quite unambiguous. If there is no appointee, that's when we get to the bottom of this hierarchy, which is a VCAT order. This is intended to be as a last resort when there is no other decision maker available. And this is where VCAT itself will essentially step into the shoes of the substitute decision maker and provide that informed consent for the use of restricted practices. So unlike Tier 3, which is done by the prospective appointee, Tier 4, this application would be made by the aged care service itself, as in they cannot find a decision maker, no one is willing to step up to be an appointee, they need to find one. When making this application, there will be the general requirements you would expect, exactly as if you were applying to VCAT for a guardianship order to get someone appointed to act as a guardian as a last resort. VCAT will need to be satisfied, of course, that there is no one else in that person's life, and VCAT may conduct its own investigations and rely on, for example, the public advocate to assist them in doing that fact-finding. But VCAT will also need to see a complete behavioural support plan that documents the need for restricted practices, that it satisfies the Commonwealth requirements, and everything's quite squared away for VCAT there to make that decision. So expect a rather high threshold, as you would expect from a court before they make that order. Some general rules around decision makers quite broadly are listed on the left. So all substitute decision makers must be available, willing, and able to act as a decision maker. This means they have to be there, they have to be contactable, for example, and they have to want to act as a decision maker. And also they have to have capacity themselves to make a decision. What this means, if any of those requirements are not met, and for example, you've got a nominee who might be a spouse, if that spouse, for example, is unwilling to act as a decision maker, or they themselves have lost capacity, that does enable you to move down the hierarchy into the next rung if that nominee is not satisfying any of those requirements. It also works, for example, at Tier 2, where you may have found the eldest adult child, but they don't want to be a decision maker. This is not a decision they want to do. If they're not willing, that does allow you to move to the next eldest child. And if they're willing and they're able and they're available, they can then act as a decision maker, for example. Some other requirements to keep in mind is they also do have to be adults, which we define in legislation as 18 and over. Some other requirements around who cannot be a decision maker, and these are important ones to keep in mind, is the decision maker cannot be the aged care provider, which is generally employees who provide aged care services under the Aged Care Act. So that's avoiding conflict of interest, for example. They also cannot be involved with the restricted practice. For example, they can't be part of assessing. If there's a physician that's been brought in to help with the behavioural assessment, that person cannot be a decision maker. We do acknowledge that family members are often consulted on the use of restricted practices as a part of doing the assessment. And they may be a decision maker, for example, in Tier 1 or Tier 2 or even Tier 3. Just by being consulted on, they are not considered to be involved with restrictive practice. They're not actually delivering aged care directly. So just because they're consulted doesn't mean they're excluded from being a decision maker under that provision. Another thing to keep in mind is anyone who is convicted, other than a spent conviction, of a crime against the care recipient is also not able to act as a substitute decision maker. Again, I appreciate that health services don't always have access to current criminal records, and it's not expected that you'll be doing background checks on everyone who says they're a decision maker. But this is more of if you are aware someone has committed a crime and they're convicted and it's not a spent conviction, try and avoid that person. Do not go to them and approach them to be a decision maker. Similarly, they can't have a current family violence intervention order against the care recipient, and that includes any family violence intervention order in Australia because they are all mutually recognised. But again, if you're not aware of an FVIO, there's not a requirement for you to satisfactorily exhaust any or knowledge of the family violence intervention order. It's just if you are aware of it, please do not approach that person to be a decision maker. Something else to keep in mind is at any point, and we appreciate these things do happen in these situations where there's disputes amongst family members, for example, VCAT has clear jurisdiction to receive applications to intervene and resolve those disputes. For example, there could be 2 nominee forms that both appoint different people as decision makers, and there's that conflict. Those people can apply to VCAT to resolve who is the appropriate decision maker. Same thing with Tier 2, for example. If someone argues that person doesn't have capacity to act as a decision maker, or there is a family violence intervention order and there's a bit of dispute around some of those exclusionary criteria, VCAT is able to intervene and resolve those disputes. We also suspect if those disputes do end up going to VCAT, VCAT is quite likely to appoint someone at Tier 3. When someone's appointed at Tier 3, they essentially override everyone else in the hierarchy at Tier 1 and Tier 2. And I apologize in advance. It seems as though there's a lot of moving around of the hierarchies, but a good way to keep in mind is if a VCAT order says someone is a decision maker, VCAT takes priority here because they are a court and they've made a court order. So if that helps you think about it in that way, court is the highest power in our land. The other thing to keep in mind is once someone has been identified or appointed as a decision maker and they've provided their decision to give or to not give consent, that is essentially final. You can't go to the next person just because you don't like the answer that they may have given you. In that situation, we appreciate it will likely create some issues for how care is provided to the care recipient. And my understanding is the Commonwealth has some guidance around how to engage with decision makers. For example, it could be a matter of revisiting what the proposed restrictive practice is, or investigating alternatives, or working with a decision maker to help them understand why it might be necessary. But it's important to keep in mind that you can't just move to the next person if you don't quite like what they say when you ask them. Our legislation does affirm some of the rights that decision makers have as well under the Commonwealth aged care legislation, which, even though it's not directly dealt with under our legislation, it's important to keep in mind, which is decision makers, of course, have the right to ask questions. They have the right to review documentation, particularly the behavioural support plan, and have access to everything that they might need to make an informed decision. So something to keep in mind as well. Now, we know there's quite a lot to unpack and a few different possible scenarios, and trying to apply this can be a bit of a question. So we've developed a range of resources that are available on our website. We can drop that link in this chat as well for people who haven't yet seen these. But we've developed fact sheets that cover off general things around acting as a decision maker or finding a decision maker, as well as dedicated fact sheets for each of those tiers as well that dive into them in a little bit more detail. We also have a visual flowchart of how to find a decision maker. If you want something that's more of a one-page ready reckoner, you can sort of flow through a decision tree to help you find the right person in that hierarchy. And of course, we also have those template forms that I referred to earlier. So that's how to nominate someone or revoke a nomination at that tier 1. So those are nice standard forms that we are working to sort of get out there and into the public consciousness, because we appreciate that will make everyone's lives easier if people have nominations in place before they enter into aged care, for example. So you hopefully, ideally, don't need to work through the hierarchy anyway. You can find that correct person. much more simply. So we are working with the community legal sector, for example, so there's a bit of awareness and people can start thinking about this type of advanced care planning in amongst the other advanced care planning or estate planning that they're working through at the same time. Have I missed anything?
Brian,
anything
I
critical?
might just jump in there to pick your brain for a few questions. Like, just wanted to emphasize the tier 2 that like there's no documentation required. It's like they're automatically appointed from the first person that is available, willing, and able to make a restricted practices decision. So, can you elaborate on that, please?
So exactly like under the medical treatment decision-making requirements there, when, for example, there isn't someone who's specifically a medical treatment decision maker or someone with power of attorney or guardianship, and you're trying to find, for example, the immediate next of kin, um, you essentially work through the hierarchy. It's exactly the same hierarchy as what's in there when that situation arises in medical treatment decision making too. So what that means is you don't have to find a form and say, please prove to me that you are the eldest child and that there is no spouse and there is no primary carer. People won't have that sort of documentation. And neither are you required to have that to satisfy yourselves that they are the decision maker. It really is more of a judgment call. So if people are withholding information and you can't find information, it turns out there is, for example, a mysterious elder sibling that you didn't know about. It wouldn't be for example, a criminal penalty on you for not knowing about that because you couldn't reasonably have known that. It really is working through the information that you have and that you know about the person to find the appropriate decision maker. But we appreciate that it can be a bit complicated because there is no clear documentation necessarily where someone can say, look, I am the decision maker, as there is at tier 1 and tier 3, for example. But that does mean that it might be important for Latameli to consider how you do document where you do find a tier 2 decision maker so that there's a clear record of who that person is and why that person is the decision maker, just so there is a bit of history there, particularly for any subsequent decisions.
Yeah, so on saying that, Ryan, we're working with Manad, which is the main platform for residential aged care in the Loddon Mallee region to have a area to document tier 1 nominated, tier 2, and to that be discussed and clarified on admission, or as we are now in retrospect of who would be that tier 2 or tier 1 person for residents or the older people that are currently living in aged care.
Excellent. Yeah, because it can be fluid as well, tier 2. It could be that 1 week you find the spouse, 3 months later, there's another behavioral support plan. The spouse has gone overseas on an Antarctic cruise, for example. They're not contactable. You don't have to go and wait for the spouse to come back because they're not available. You can move down the hierarchy and perhaps find the eldest adult child and have them act as a decision maker in that instance. And then 3 months later, when there's a second review, the spouse is back and contactable. You can go back to the spouse as well because they are the first person in the hierarchy. So it is meant to be flexible as well to account for situations where people are there one day and not there the next day. So it's important to keep in mind that's why we've deemed it as a temporary decision maker, because tier 2 is not a set and forget.
Ryan, just like a question around VCAT disputes. If there's a dispute at tier 1 or tier 2, would it be the person in the dispute to make the VCAT application?
Right. So if you're engaging with someone who says, I'm a nominee, here's the paperwork, and we just assume for argument's sake that is one of the children. If another child of the aged care resident comes up and says they shouldn't be the nominee, I think there's coercion or something like that, and they have a dispute, that person will need to file the application to VCAT. So that's not on you as the aged care provider to resolve those disputes. You're not there to go, hold on, I think you have a case, let's weigh in and get involved. If that person really has an issue, they will need to make the application to VCAT. In the meantime, as far as you're aware, if everything looks in order and they seem to be the appropriate decision maker, and there's nothing else that's a little bit dodgy, for example, around family violence considerations or anything like that, it just seems more like a family dispute. You don't need to involve yourselves necessarily in applying to VCAT or anything. If you seem satisfied with the information that you have and the documentation that people have provided, you can work on that basis.
Thank you, Ryan. Hopefully that clears that up around VCAT applications and disputes. There's another question here is there retrospective for existing residents in care prior to the 1st of July? And will it be challenging for them to complete a Tier 1 nominee form? Is there a requirement for a JP to witness and determine capacity to complete that form?
So there's a few points there which I'll address separately to try and answer the question fully. Whether or not these requirements are retrospective, they are retrospective in the sense that they do apply to anyone in aged care that's still in aged care, of course, after 1 July 2025. It's not retrospective in the sense that any behavioural support plans that are consented to and in place before 1 July 2025 need to be reopened and reconsented to. That's not the case. What's consented to already remains consented to, despite whoever was making that consent, as long as it was legal prior to the settings that applied before 1 July 2025. That seemed a bit convoluted with all the dates I'm throwing around. The bottom line is you don't need to get fresh consent unless there is a new decision being made, is the very short answer there. If someone had a nominee under the Commonwealth temporary hierarchy, because the Commonwealth in their temporary hierarchy did have nominees, our legislation automatically recognises them as nominees under this new hierarchy. So if they had a Commonwealth nominee appointed then, and there's paperwork that shows that, it's automatically taken that they automatically become a nominee under this framework as well. There's no need to complete that form again. It transfers over automatically. If someone didn't have a nomination in place prior to 1 July 2025, and they now need a decision maker today on the 4th of August, but they haven't made a nomination and they no longer have capacity, Tier 1 is not going to be an option for them, because you can only make a nomination if you have capacity to make that nomination. And in that scenario, you'll need to defer then to Tier 2.
Yep. Thank you for that, Ryan. There's a few questions around if the resident has restricted practices on admission, has no one available at Tier 1, Tier 2 and Tier 3, when the provider is seeking that VCAT application to be a substitute decision maker, who would provide consent in the interim for the use of restricted practices?
Good question. And I know that's a sticky scenario. The short answer is no one can provide that consent in the interim. It has to be someone in this hierarchy. So it would mean that you can't use restricted practices in that scenario until there's someone who can legally give that consent. What could apply, however, in the interim is emergency use of restricted practices, which is enabled for under the Commonwealth legislation, and there are particular requirements, for example, for what is an emergency scenario, as well as some mandatory reporting requirements, I believe, under that provision. But the short answer is you cannot use restricted practices unless there is that informed consent. That's a hardline Commonwealth requirement that they have put in place.
Can the primary carer be a neighbour or friend who has an ongoing personal or caring relationship?
Absolutely. If they are, if they deliver care or have delivered care, and for example, when they move into residential aged care, that care might be, they're visiting them quite frequently or helping them out with whatever it is they need. Yeah, there is no requirement for a carer to be an immediate family member. It could be. Yeah, we haven't defined who that is beyond they are in a carer type relationship. As long as it's not a commercial carer, it's quite broad who can be a carer for the purposes of that one.
Thank you, Ryan. What communication has gone out to GP specialists who may be prescribing a chemical restraint as a GP specialist requires us to seek informed consent? They may seek it from a medical power of attorney, who may in turn be different from our restricted practices substitute decision maker as identified by the provider. This might get confusing.
Yes, it can get very confusing because when is a medication not a medication, and when does it become a restricted practice is really the nub of the answer to that question. So under the Commonwealth legislation, there is a dual requirement for chemical restraint where you need to have not only a restricted practices substitute decision maker, but you also do need to have that GP signing off on the use of that medication as a chemical restraint. It would be inaccurate to say that those GPs or specialists should be finding someone under the Medical Treatment Decision Making Act, because unless that medication is used as a medical treatment, which is treating a diagnosed medical condition, that medication is not actually medication. It is chemical restraint and it is a form of restricted practice, and they shouldn't be going to a medical treatment decision maker. They should be going to the restricted practices substitute decision maker. And appreciate that it's going to be very complicated to tease out when is something a restricted practice when it does have therapeutic value. But the bottom line is it really is a question of is this medication being prescribed to treat a medical condition, or is it being used purely to manage problematic behaviors or provide behavioral support? So there is a bit of a fine line between those two things, and therefore who is the appropriate person to give that consent. Unfortunately, we're not able to really weigh into when is medication not restricted practice, because that's a line the Commonwealth has drawn in their legislation. And I don't want to provide advice that might run contrary to the Commonwealth's position on that one, but I would certainly urge you all to engage with the resources the Commonwealth has produced. And if you have questions, definitely address them to the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission, because that's definitely their area to help out there. But I appreciate that as a very tricky space.
Is there any more questions? Questions are very good, Amy. Very impressive.
Testing us.
Oh, no. Danielle, did that clear up your question? I think that makes sense.
Yeah, it did. I think that it's more around with the tier 1. Getting people, it's going to be very challenging for people who are already in care. It's already challenging for people who aren't in care, who are waiting to be admitted. It's not something that people know about out of the community.
I thought what Ryan explained, though, if they were in care and they'd already nominated someone, that remains in place. They accept the hierarchy that was chosen by the resident before. Is that right, Ryan?
So the Commonwealth had a temporary hierarchy in place since 2022, which also had a nominee at the top, which was pretty much, I nominate you to be my restricted practices SDM. If they did that in, say, 2022, after 1 July 2025, that automatically carries over into this framework. So for all intents and purposes, that Commonwealth appointment pre-2025 becomes a Victorian appointment post-2025.
And you don't need...
Oh, yeah. Sorry, Dodie. I was just going to say, I don't know about anyone else, but we certainly didn't have residents do that routinely.
No, I just think anyone that you've got to sign, anyone that's documented as their nominee and who currently signs their restrictive practice would remain that person because it was in place prior to 2020.
Jodie, that's if they've got a behavioural support plan already. I think that's how it was explained. But there are a lot of residents who may not have yet a behaviour support plan who may now, at some point soon require one. So then going through the nominee process is not going to be straightforward.
Yeah. No.
It's
I think that's what Danny was concerned about with the second question.
And I mean, it is going to delay admissions as well, because we're asking for it for new admissions. People who have capacity, right? You need to complete your nominee form. So, you've got people calling into a JP, a lawyer, whoever on the way to be admitted. And then, for people who are already here, it's an added layer of stress.
If it does help, a nominee at tier 1 is really the ideal scenario, and it certainly we would hope over time they're a bit more common and certainly known. So there's definitely some awareness raising that we are undertaking right now to build that capability and capacity up. But if there is no nominee in place and it's not viable to find one, for example, you do have a BSP that needs to be consented to, and if there is simply no nominee at tier 1, you can move to tier 2 without needing to find one first. So if there is not a nominee in place, the onus is not on you as the aged care provider to have one set up before you move to tier 2. It really is there one in place? Yes or no? If the answer is no, you can go straight to tier 2. There's no obligation or burden for you to encourage the person to make a nominee first. That is not the requirement, but it might be tidier for you. You have a tier 2 making decision today, but in the background, you're really encouraging that person to make a tier 1. So in the future, it's a lot clearer and easier.
Just sorry, with the tier 2, is every time you have to give a PRN quetiapine, for example, do you need to? How often do you need to do it? Like, if there's a change in regular medication, antipsychotic?
So the answer to that question is it's just based on the behavioral support plan. If the BSP says, there's quetiapine, it's PRN, these are the conditions in which it's given. If someone's consented to that BSP with that medication and those provisions for when and how it's used, you don't need to seek consent each and every time, as long as it is within the confines of what the BSP says. If you're going beyond the behavioral support plan, that is when you will need to essentially redo or refresh the behavioral support plan to account for what that change in proposed restricted practice is. And that's not a state requirement, that's a Commonwealth-based requirement. But if it's documented in the BSP and that BSP has been consented to, that's that. You may want to notify every time you do use it, but that's not necessarily consent.
Yep. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. So the behavioral support plan is essential to all this, and that is what's consented to, is the BSP as a whole.
We just have a question in the chat around what is the department's expectation of monitoring restricted practices used?
So as far as the Victorian government's concerned, as in us, the Department of Health, the Department of Health, this is not our space. We are not regulating restricted practices or aged care. It is purely the Commonwealth. So we are not going through and checking people's BSPs and seeing how people are adhering to this framework. You are all obligated under the Commonwealth Aged Care Act to adhere to this framework, for example, and make sure you're reporting as you need to report. But the state government, we're not doing any compliance or monitoring or seeking anything from you. We may send through surveys to try and understand for ourselves how this is working and trying to help pull up on some of those pain points, but that's not sort of a compliance mandatory activity. That's just us trying to ask questions. But what you're doing now in terms of that compliance stuff with the Commonwealth and the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission, that is it. That's that. And I don't want to say that's that as in it's so simple and easy, because I know it's not. But we're not adding to that. We're not creating another layer here for restricted practices. That's not our business.
Thank you, Ryan. There's a question here from Amy. Tier 2 temporary decision makers are required to consent each time the BSP is reviewed, or is it just when there is a new restricted practice introduced?
So the answer to that is it really is more when there is a new restricted practice introduced or when you've changed a restricted practice. So if you review a behavioral support plan and there's no change, there's no need for fresh consent. If you review a behavioral support plan and you're adding or changing a restricted practice, that would require fresh consent, and that's when you would re-engage and find the appropriate decision maker at that instance. But if you do a review and there's no change, there's nothing that needs consenting to. It's sort of like if you, in thinking more in the medical side of things, if you have one treatment, a plan, and you review it in 2 weeks' time and it hasn't necessarily changed, you don't necessarily need to seek that consent again. It's the same sort of principle here. It might be, though, that your behavioral support plan does say, we will do this for 3 months and then we see how we go. That might then require consent to continue doing the same thing after 3 months. So it really does depend on what's in the behavioral support plan. That is what is central to when you do need to seek consent again. Does that make sense?
Amy, are you happy with that?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Any more questions? Do we have any more questions? Ryan or Tom, this has been fantastic.
Jodie, do you have any questions?
No, I think the clarity of, which I think was the complicated one, is if someone was already in aged care and they weren't yet on a restricted practice, or they might need to be, and trying to get tier 1 consent, which will be difficult. If that is not possible, we can go to tier 2 stage, is, I think, quite a relief. Because especially in some of the rural and remote areas, it just would not be possible to follow the tier 1 stage to get a justice of the peace or someone in to sign that nomination.
Yeah. Yeah, the tier 1 is intended for us to replicate, for example, powers of attorney arrangements, where that sort of stuff is done. It's formalized in advance. It's not meant to be something you do in the moment because you have to. But it's great when it's in place. You know, that's what we're trying to enable, is that sort of stuff.
Question around VCAT. Do we know the timeframes for VCAT approval of appointees, or an order of VCAT if we needed to go down the tier 3 or tier 4 line?
Yeah, very good question. Unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that. It really is subject to VCAT, what they're juggling on the day or in that given week, and of course the urgency of the application and any implications for a delay in VCAT getting to it, for example. So the short answer is how long it is a piece of string. But we are working with VCAT around this one because we do appreciate VCAT delays are a concern across the board. And to do that, we've given VCAT quite a bit of flexibility in how they can manage these applications. Unlike in other matters, for example, the guardianship list, where there's quite strict rules in how VCAT convenes hearings, for example, we've given VCAT a lot more flexibility in this space. They can do a more scaled down version of a hearing if the risk appetite would allow that on a case-by-case basis. So I don't have any clear numbers or anything, because it really is dependent on the particular application and what's happening at that time. But if it does provide some comfort, there's a lot of flexibility here for VCAT, because we do want to avoid delays and protracted decision making.
Yeah, I've just pasted VCAT's particular webpage that deals with restricted practices and aged care in the chat. So
yeah,
that details the process and what they can do.
Yeah, the idea is, for example, if VCAT's made the decision once at tier 4 and you come back 3 months later with a slight revision to the BSP that needs reconsenting to, in theory, VCAT is able to make that decision on the papers, which means they don't convene a hearing. They just look at what's in front of them and make that decision based on the evidence, and they don't have to go through the whole rehashing of everything unless they deem it's necessary to do so. That's quite a change from the guardianship list, where there is quite a lot of rigor and prescribed processes they must go through. So we've given VCAT flexibility to sort of not do things that they don't really have to do in this space. But how that plays out is really case by case. And I wish I could give a clear answer.
Thank you, Ryan. There's a comment here from Danielle. It's challenging to determine capacity prior to admission and then identify the tier 2 decision maker. It is currently delaying admissions at times.
I appreciate that is quite complicated, the capacity question, and I know that it's really more of the Commonwealth's space to define when someone has capacity under the Aged Care Act itself, particularly since I know that they are going for a strengths-based approach and considering whether or not someone can make decisions with the support of someone else, and that can be quite a tricky grey area for people to quickly work in. All I can really say is, as much as possible, lean on the Commonwealth for assistance there. I do believe the Commonwealth they haven't prescribed a clear definition for what is capacity. So there's a lot of room for that to be interpreted on a case by case basis. And whether that's, for example, having one or two clinicians make an assessment and sort of working with that as your basis. I'm not quite clear whether or not the Commonwealth, has any particular guidance to that. It's rather loose. Any other questions?
Yeah.
Or even more of these pain points for you guys. It's good for us just to keep awareness of them, because we will be doing a review of this legislation in time, and we want to make sure as these pain points do arise that we're aware of them, so we can think about what we can do if possible to sort of work with them and try and make them a bit easier. So it is probably one point which we haven't gotten to, which is we don't want this to be a set and forget by us, where we just say, here's the legislation, good luck. We do want to hear how it's working. We do want to hear if there are any pain points. We want to hear and help out with any questions you have as well. So we can send through our email details so you can send them through. We'd love to hear how it's working or how it's not working as well.
Would some of the questions that have come through today be helpful for a question and answer sort of template maybe to put on your page?
We actually have one on the go question. that in FAQs that we're working on. So we can come back when that's something that we're ready to share, because it's full of some frequently asked questions.
Yes.
Yeah. But we can add these ones in too. Yeah.
Particularly probably that if there's no one to do the tier 1 when a resident's in
what
a
does
facility.
That mean?
Yeah. I think that's
we can make that one a bit clearer. Yeah.
And I think that also the fact if there is no tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, is there anyone else that can do it? And the answer is no, which is then going to cause the bed flow issue, because we won't, or aged care facilities will not accept the potential older person, and the acute will be saying that they're blocking beds, really, basically.
Yeah, they'll say it's not our problem.
Yeah.
Yeah. We've heard there's quite a bit of that.
But hopefully, as it moves on, VCAT might move faster with the process to alleviate some of those issues. Particularly maybe if it's like an environmental restraint for a acquired medical condition.
Yeah.
Safety. Is there any other questions, or do you think the frequently asked questions will be helpful once they come out for everyone to send through? Really good questions, though. Good ones put out.
There's one more comment. Danielle's pointed out restrictive practices are quite broad, and that keypads on doors are considered RPs, and most facilities have locked doors. So,
well, it's an RP if the person doesn't have the code or can't remember the code, and there's no other alternative for getting around, which again is a Commonwealth definition and very vague and scenario based. But yeah, it is a big complicating factor that a lot of things are restricted practices under the Commonwealth definition. a lot of things that we might take for granted as well. Things we just don't think about. It's yeah, I think a little bit tricky.
Definitely. If that person doesn't have a tier 1, 2 or 3. All right, well, if that's it, I'm going to thank Tom and Ryan for their time today because that was fantastic. Just to let everyone know that together with the PCG, we're putting together a draft guideline with the help of Amy and Nicole. Just sent a copy to Ryan and Tom for them to review it. So we're hoping that we have a guideline for restrictive practice, particularly about these changes, and also working together with MANAD to have a consistent place to document the tier 1, 2 or 3 substitute decision maker to make it clearer in your process of who that is and who would be reviewing or signing the consent. Thank you for today, Tom and Ryan. Appreciate it.
For having us, and yeah, please feel free to send through any questions or gripes and grumbles. We love to hear it and we'd love to help out where we can.
We definitely will send through questions if we have more, because it's much easier working it out together and having these conversations. Because on the first week, I think Danielle and I spent about an hour on the phone trying to work out the process for tier 2.
Oh, that's not good. Well,
hopefully in theory it makes sense, but it's just trying to find those little areas of when they don't quite fit into the box, really.
Yeah, which is probably every case.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for your questions. Sammy. There is Amy. She's still there. Meredith. Abby, still there?